In this second part of our podcast on Muslim representation in film and entertainment media, Ruqayya, Khadija, and I brainstorm potential solutions to the issue of misrepresentation of Muslims on mainstream media platforms. So today we're going to be talking about part 2 of the series on Muslim representation in film and entertainment media. And we'll be talking about different solutions that we've thought up that could potentially help us fix the issue of the misrepresentation that we're constantly seeing in media when it comes to Muslims. And so I do want to start with last time after we finished recording our podcast. Khadija, you called me and then you were talking about some of the things that we have to keep in mind when we're thinking of solutions in sort of like looking at the people who've gone through a similar situation in the past and not looking at it as like a unique issue to Muslims, but really building off of the ideas of people who've gone through similar misrepresentations and who've found successfully some solutions to that issue.
Right. That's very important. Yeah, Muslims are just one in a long line of different minority groups that have been singled out and misrepresented in media.
Yeah. And just like how quite a few minority groups have been successful in making it completely unacceptable for the media and people in general to hold those sentiments publicly. So like just the small and maybe not so small things that we see, like even in Aladdin and things like that, that's kind of stuff with other religious groups or other racial group that would be a big no-no, right? And they've done so successfully because they've projected their idea and put themselves out there and made it completely unacceptable to
Unapologetic.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So like refusing to allow people to treat you a certain way, which I think Muslims tend to sort of keep it on the DL and like not stand up for what we know to be our rights. We tend to allow people to step all over us. And so just refusing to do that, refusing to allow people to represent us in a way that's not the way that we actually are, is an important thing to keep in mind.
Yeah, we shouldn't be afraid to be confrontational about things that are important to us.
Yes, especially when they're blatantly wrong.
Exactly.
And I think we were also talking about more specifically like the Black Muslim movement and realizing that where we are right now is because of the hard work that was put in by Black Muslims who were here first and who really started the revolution to show Muslims more prominently in America.
Exactly.
And when we're looking into solutions, it's also important to acknowledge the people who've actually made it so that we've come this far. Because yes, we are misrepresented, but we're known. And there's a lot of things that people know about Islam specifically from the fact that there were Black Muslim Americans who fought for that representation for us.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And so like the question is now, as young Muslim women without a platform, how can we seek to change that narrative? Or what solutions do we have, even if it's not like specifically in our power to change that narrative, but what can other people do, or what needs to happen for us to feel more represented in media?
I feel like we don't have to shoot really big. We can even start by like amplifying quote unquote smaller voices in our community. So like media representation, like we were saying before, it comes first and foremost to display, showcase our accomplishments and our experiences to our own people. So once we've got that down pat, we can move on to representing to other people, you know? There's still a lot of like budding filmmakers and people in the arts and within our communities that are not backed up the way that they need to be backed up. If we start by giving them the spotlight, showing people who we feel represent us completely, wholly, and authentically, and giving them the stage, then they will be able to get tapped into by bigger media outlets. So I think the first thing that we can do is really honing our attention to people in the media within our Muslim community.
Yeah, those that are already here. I feel like there are actually a lot of young, or even, maybe several experienced filmmakers, directors, and stuff. People who are in our communities it's impossible that there's not. There's so many creative minds in the Muslim community. People who want to create this sort of representative media, we should really look out for those people and give them every sort of attention that we can so that they can also be looked at. So if we pay attention to them, then other people will also notice, and then that builds their platform.
Yeah, I definitely do agree. I think oftentimes as a community, when we're looking at how we're being represented, we look at changing the views of the Western world around us. And I don't think we give enough attention to changing the views inside the Muslim community and really making sure that the Muslim community is unified on how we're planning on distorting those misrepresentations that are often portrayed about us. So I think it's important to look at like the Western world and how we're going to change that, but also it's more important, maybe because we just don't look at it at all, but it's more important to also focus on our own community in enlightening them and making sure that they understand what the truth is about how we're being represented and how we should be represented. And also making sure that we're giving ourselves tools to represent ourselves in a more positive light.
I was going to say also, there's also like not just, shedding light on creators and, producers of entertainment media that represents Muslims, but also giving a platform to those pieces of media that have already been created and do represent Muslims in a really wholesome, in a really accurate way. It's rare, but there are some out there, and they're like, I've seen them and they're very well done. When you see something that's really well done, you really want to shed light on it because it could really transform the minds of so many.
Yeah.
And so like taking those and trying to like amplify them, not just in the Muslim community, but also outside of it. I don't know if you guys have heard of the show Scam.
No.
So it's a Norwegian show, so it's not in English, but they have been remakes of it that have been in English. And it's like different seasons about different characters, and one of the characters is a Muslim woman. And it's all about her and her struggle as a Muslim woman in a non-Muslim setting in Norway. And in the beginning, you're worried because it's like, oh, is this a stereotypical? She's living in a non-Muslim world and she's so pressured to take off her hijab and stop praying and, party and all that stuff. But it's like a genuine struggle, and it's a genuine, like, you see her doing her salah, you see how she is in Ramadan, you see how she interacts with other people, her parents, her community, her masjid, while also that not being the only thing about her. It's also like kind of a love story because she's into another Muslim guy or whatever. And so it really hits the spot on all the things that we were talking about representation when it comes to like Islam not being her only character trait, the fact that she struggles with it, but it's not something that she completely denies, or Islam not being like an oppressive factor in her life, but being very, very significant. It's like all those things about that show. And the actor herself, she's a very dedicated Muslim, and it was her goal in this show to be as authentic to her Islamic self as possible. That season of that show, it's about 15 or 20 episodes. I feel like everyone should watch it. When we find something like that, we should definitely put it on our platform. We should share it. We should amplify it. We should, put it out there.
Yeah. 100%. That's amazing. I haven't even heard of that.
Yeah, and doesn't that say something, the fact that we haven't heard of it? Like, it's not being publicized in a way that really speaks to the Muslim audience that would be watching it or could be watching it. And the fact that it's representative and it's not in the spotlight means something.
Yeah, they don't want it.
Or maybe it doesn't match the representation of Muslims that they're more familiar with, and therefore it's not in the spotlight.
Right.
I think it's definitely important to amplify the voices of people who've done work that's already out there, making sure that those circulate the Muslim community especially, and then maybe from there moving on to like the Western community at large.
Right.
So those are a couple of ways that we can sort of change the view of the Muslim population specifically on how we want to be represented and what things we can do in the Muslim community to be more representative of ourselves. Can you guys think of anything else that would affect like the Muslim community specifically in changing the way that we're represented?
I don't know a specific thing that we could do, but I think it's really important changing the mindset of people from the root, kind of. Like, if Muslims have better idea of who they are, then they can also represent themselves better. Because I feel like sometimes, you're living in a community where there's so much going around you that goes against some of the values that you hold very dear to you, that sometimes when people ask you questions about your religion, or people ask you why you do a certain thing, or ask you why you are this way, it's hard for you to answer because you don't even have the knowledge of it, or you don't even know why you don't do it or why you do it. And so I think one of our biggest solutions, not just amplifying the voices that are in our community, but just from the very beginning, relearning our religion, being able to get closer with it and appreciate. When you appreciate all the beauties of your religion, then you want to share it with the world in the most authentic way.
Yeah, absolutely.
Understanding our own religion is really, really important so that we can teach others, and then you can show them the beauty of it. And then obviously there's beauty that you can represent in media. People love seeing it. And so
I think that's 100% like a really important point. I think that Muslims can sometimes be seen as being on the defensive, and actually more than sometimes, a lot of times we're seen as being on the defensive, and we're not being defended well because we just don't know enough about our religion to defend ourselves, to know what people normally think and what the truth actually is. And I think especially in a world where we're so much the minority, it's easy to shift our viewpoint to that of like the Western society and not to that of I'm a Muslim and these are my beliefs. So oftentimes you'll see Muslims who don't like Muslims or who don't like Islam or who don't practice the religion or they don't even understand it, And when they're asked questions by non-Muslims, because as a minority, we're constantly asked questions about our identities, about what we believe in, they're not able to refute claims made by the West. And that sort of diminishes their affiliation with their religion. And it's like a never-ending cycle of like, I don't know enough, so I can't refute other people, so I'll stop believing in my religion. And when people ask me more questions, I don't know enough, so I'll stop believing in my religion.
And not only that, if somebody tells me something contradictory as if they know my religion when they do not, I will most likely believe them and I will change my own views about my own self.
Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah.
Like you were saying, like a really important part of this is learning our own religion so that when we're representing ourselves, we do it in the most accurate way so that we can force others to represent us in an accurate way as well.
Exactly. Yeah.
So we've spoken a little bit about what we can do in the Muslim community to really amplify a correct representation of ourselves. But I think it's also important to think about the other aspect of that, of what we can do in the Western world to amplify our voices there as well. I think it's important to think of this as like a two-ended thing, what we do on the Muslim side of things and what we do on the Western side of things.
Right.
And I think one of the first things that we need to think about is the fact that in a lot of these situations that we were talking about last time, a lot of those little inaccuracies could have been fixed with just a little bit more care in making sure that the representation was accurate. So the fact that like the Arabic script was not actually Arabic. If you had gotten someone who was Arab or someone who even spoke a little bit of Arabic or could read it, they could have easily told you that that doesn't actually mean anything. But like we don't see that. We don't see the Western society looking for people to make authentic the representation that they're putting out there. And so I think one thing that we should not withstand anymore is Hollywood not caring about how we're being represented. If we see misrepresentation, we as a community need to stand up and be like, no, this was a simple thing that you could have easily fixed. And the fact that you didn't do that shows how little you care.
And we've seen in the past that putting pressure on film, on the industry, does actually create a change, like with Aladdin, right? Yeah. They did not like that way that those lyrics in the beginning of the song were, and there was enough people who protested it that were like, this is wrong, this is a bad representation of us, that they changed it. So like, if we see something that is blatantly not our religion, or something that's, either demonizing it or undercutting it or just completely making it something that it's not, we should not be afraid to say something. Because if enough voices come together and say something about it, then things will be changed. Or at least maybe there will be like a consideration. It's like you have the resources to reach out to many, many people. Like, anyone would love to to be part of a Disney or any TV show. Like, that's not hard. So finding good Muslims who really want to represent their own culture. Like, I'm talking about a diverse amount of people who can really give you a wholesome idea of what our religion is. Those are people who are not sparse in this country. So there's no excuse, basically. And so we should really hold them accountable to that.
Yeah, so I definitely do agree with you. I think that Aladdin was not a one-of-its-kind sort of movie in its misrepresentation. There were a lot of movies made at that time, or even now, that are so misrepresentative. And I think the fact that Aladdin was geared towards children was something that really got to Muslims. And that's what made them stand up for being properly represented. Like, it goes back to the point that we were talking about before about being lenient and not standing up for ourselves when we need to. And I think that it's important that even if it's a grievance that wouldn't necessarily be seen as a very large thing, to still talk about it and to still be like, this is what you guys see us as, and this is inaccurate and needs to be changed.
Right. Yeah, it's very, very important.
Yeah. Another thing that we all know is that Hollywood is filled to the brim with white men as directors, as actors, as producers. White men are really the ones that are creating all of the content that we see for the most part. Sure, there are women, there are people of color, but you don't really see that as much as the white men. And so I think that in order to really be as authentic as possible, it's important to have Hollywood find more representative actors, more directors, more producers that represent Islam in the way that it's supposed to be represented. And it doesn't have to be Hollywood that finds these people. It could be us that finds these people and push them towards the forefront, right? Push them towards a place where they can make a difference in how we're being represented. If we want to be represented in the mainstream media in a way that is accurate, it's important for us to push these people out there into the mainstream platform so that they can represent us there in a way that's very accurate. The majority of people will watch things on mainstream platforms only, or for the most part, and so getting it out there is where it can really make, I think, the biggest impact.
I wanted to say something on this that I don't want to bring it back to like what the Muslim community can do, because you said that this was a two-pronged kind of solution. But like when we do push people from our community out, the ones that we know that represent us well, I know a lot of times when young Muslims or people in our communities kind of get a spotlight, there's also criticism within our own communities of those people, maybe because they're not, I don't know, they're not exactly how we want them to be. Or, you know, they're differing lifestyles or like opinions about certain things that sometimes one little group inside a Muslim community will hold on to much more than it needs to be. You know what I'm saying? Yeah. And then you kind of ostracize those people from your own communities. I think it's very important that when we do try giving platforms to our own Muslim entertainers, we should definitely make all of our communities, like our masjids, our community centers, our gatherings, open to those people to come back to. Because if, you know, going out there is like the only acceptance that they'll get, they'll leave, they'll start losing that connection with the community that they're representing. To make sure that when we do give those representatives, actors, any sort of entertainers, that platform, we should definitely make sure that they can come back home.
Yeah,
definitely.
Yeah, that's so important.
I also feel like we shouldn't expect every representative to be representative of us personally, because the Muslim community is really vast, so we might not be able to come to terms with every single aspect of the way every single person who's an entertainer leads their life or decides to carry themselves the way they do, and that's okay, right? But we shouldn't expect every entertainer to be us, essentially, unless we're taking that up ourselves. So I think that's a really good point.
Yeah. And I think it's something that, like, even the Muslims who are currently in popular media or who currently have some sort of following, it's something that they reiterate a lot of times. Like, sure, we're not represented, but all I can do as a person is represent myself and represent how I see the world. And if you're not okay with that, like, you can represent yourself too. That's a thing that you're allowed to do. So it's important to know that, like, people can only represent what they've seen, right? They can only represent from their own experiences. And so it's important not to bash people or to call them out on little things if what they're really truly trying to do is represent Islam.
Right. And that's why it's very important for entertainment media in general, the people that have that power, is to bring more of them, Because if you bring more Muslims, different types of Muslims, then you get more representation from different aspects. Like, you get nuance, you get differences that can represent a more broad span of Muslim community. If you only have one person representing the entire ummah, then you're obviously going to have people who are like, that's not me. But if you have more people there that are on the stage, you can be like, okay, this person doesn't represent me completely. This person definitely does, and I'm going to stick with this person. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah. But to be the devil's advocate for 1 second, it's so important to push these Muslims to the forefront and not hate on them when they get there. But it's also like the types of Muslims that we're currently seeing being represented and the way that they want to be represented is not necessarily the way that we would want Islam to be represented.
Right.
So it's also this, and I think it might just be the fact that we don't have enough people out there, or maybe it's just the type of people who hold that to a high priority are not the types of people that necessarily represent Islam in the most accurate way. So it's like a two-pronged thing where like we want to push as many people up there, but also we don't want them to misrepresent Islam. So
yeah.
And I think it's also like we put a lot of pressure on these people to be a certain way that they're not, and that's not fair to them either. But it's also not fair to be misrepresented constantly over and over again. So it's like, how do we bridge that issue?
I mean, we could just try to increase awareness about how if they do something, that they don't attribute it to their Islam, if that makes sense. Do you know what I mean? Like, yeah, sure, be your own personality and do you, but don't, because I mean, this is a really hotly debated thing. Like, do you use your platform as like a Muslim influencer and then do things that go against what a lot of people believe in, but use that for your clout essentially? But the problem comes down to that the same idea that everything they do is about them being Muslim, and that's actually something that we have to acknowledge because like we said before, it is a way of life. So that's probably going to be your primary identifier when you're coming into arenas like these of media. So I don't know, it's a very touchy topic.
Yeah. And recently I was watching a podcast that had three very well-known, or at least two very well-known on American media platforms, and one very well-known, like, British Muslim influencer.
Yeah, I think I know what you're talking about. Yeah. What podcast is?
Yeah. I think you would know. But anyway, they were talking about this issue of like just not being sure how to portray themselves or what angle to approach being on this wider platform from. And one of the more experienced influencers was talking about how they will never be able to please everyone. And so it's important not to look at it from that angle. And therefore, they should only ever represent themselves, because if you try to please Muslims, Muslims won't be happy. If you try to please the West won't be happy. So coming at it from your own angle is the best way to go. But then they're receiving hate for that as well, because, their own angle is not necessarily representative of Islam, and it's not what the West wants to see either. One of them was really set on being a figure who spoke for Islam.
Right.
But I don't know if he identifies as a strong Muslim. So it was this struggle of like, how would I represent myself? Because no matter what I do, like, Muslims can criticize literally anything. So, I'm going to be receiving criticism from there. And also, because of who I am, I might not receive opportunities that I would otherwise from Western media, Western film. So where exactly should I stand?
Yeah, I feel like we should definitely keep that in mind with the people that we want, or the people that are representing us. It's going to be hard. Like, it's not easy for them. They really have to walk a tight line of, what do I stay authentic to? Because like you said, one of them was saying that he wants to be as authentically Muslim and represent his religion, but even he himself is figuring out what that is, or isn't at it completely. But I think another point, like, we should really stick to is, like, you cannot please everyone. But the solution to that is getting more people out there so that you're not pleasing that group, but another person is pleasing that group, and then there's another person pleasing another group. So you're just kind of like getting all of your corners with more representation that is accurate to whatever group is good with it. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
as long as they're being authentic and saying that I'm representing myself or my Islam to the best of my ability, there will be people that resonate with it, and then there will be people that don't, but then you'll have another person.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And with regards to whoever says that they, represent Islam and are out there as Muslims being their primary identity, I'm gonna go old school here, but like, if you're authentic to yourself and to your religion, no matter how many haters you have, you'll be respected, if that makes sense. Like, you will, by constantly morphing and trying to please other people, you're gonna look fake in the eyes of everyone. Be it a Muslim audience, be that non-Muslim audience, American, British, whatever it may be, it'll show. So I think if you are a Muslim, and this is for all influencers and myself included in our small circles, that whenever you're authentic to your religion, in whatever capacity you have, however much knowledge you have of your religion, when you're authentic to it, people will respect you for sticking to that. Especially, like you said, like how that person might not have that many opportunities. It really shows as being somebody who has integrity, who's honest with themselves, and that's admirable, no matter what community you're from, and it'll take you far.
Yeah. And, like, you can't be a perfect person. You can't always represent Islam 100% the way that it's supposed to be represented. But I think staying true to yourself and also, like, representing Islam to the best of your ability is the way to go.
Definitely.
And then I think we were also talking about the fact that, yes, it's important to represent ourselves appropriately in our own communities, and it's important to represent ourselves appropriately in the Western media arena just generally. But it's also important to understand that the Western world is not going to create opportunities for us that fit what we want to be spoken of about our narrative, right? So the opportunities that they give us for acting or for film or for entertainment in the industry are not necessarily going to match what we would like people to see about us.
Right.
And so it's important to not just cave to what roles they want us to be put in. If we don't agree with some role that they want us to be in, to not stand for that role and to not take it, and to encourage other Muslim actors to not take that role. And instead to just build our own table, right? To create our own platform where we can represent ourselves in the positions, in the roles that we want to be represented, and in the way that we want to be represented.
Right. Yeah. I have a question I want to bounce off of you guys, because it's something that I was thinking about while I was thinking about doing this episode. It's something that we've been talking about, but like, how do you get your foot in the door? Let's say me. Let's say I wanted to have a role in, I don't know, some production. How am I supposed to get my foot into the door when my very existence and who I am and who I stand for is not welcome in that area? And I get the thing about, make yourself welcome and everything, but I don't feel comfortable. Let's say as a practicing Muslim, I wouldn't feel comfortable being in that narrative or being in those environments, right? Because that's how it is. And point blank, it is what it is, right? So how am I supposed to get my foot in the door without them expecting me to compromise? And the fact of the matter is, there is going to be some compromise. And that compromise is not going to be a petty compromise. It's going to be something to do with my religion. So I strongly feel that, and we've said it, like you just said, Sumaya, about independent media should supersede everything before trying to hit it big with Hollywood. Because I strongly believe that, how we're talking about this representation and getting more people. And like we said, that there's so many people that are untapped. They're untapped for a reason. Do you know how bizarre it would look like if suddenly all the people we wanted to see were shown? You're stitching a narrative, and we're not the authors of that narrative. So it's like you will always be trying to get your foot into a system that doesn't want you.
Yeah.
So it's so difficult. And the point of not compromising is close to impossible.
Yeah.
If you want to be authentic. But then you're left with the thing that, okay, wait, you start from scratch, right? You have to start grassroots media organizations, and that doesn't have a big audience, right? You might just get a couple people within your community. So how do you go big without losing yourself is my question.
I think that's so, yeah. It's a really difficult question to answer because we never know what the future holds. We don't know in the next couple of years what media will look like. And so it's hard to figure out exactly what the best approach would be.
Nowadays, people are relying less with everything being on the internet. I feel like this is the best opportunity for independent streaming. You don't need that huge production anymore. People are online. They're on Netflix. They're on other types of channels and stuff like that. Getting a show or any sort of entertainment media that is more grassroots, more independent out there and getting it popular, I feel like it's more plausible and more easy to do now more than ever. So I think that's a very positive thing, and I think Maya mentioning that we don't know what media will look like in the next few years.
Yeah. But also it's like, how easy will it be to get a representative independent film or TV show onto streaming services such as Netflix or Hulu or things that people already have? And then when it's there, how to promote it so that people will actually watch it on those streaming services.
Right. And I think that comes down to our priorities, because this actually happened with specifically Netflix, right? I don't know if you guys remember, there was a production group who was trying to premiere this Netflix series called Salah ad-Din, and it was epic. I mean, that trailer, the quality was really amazing, but it never got it. It never got the deal with Netflix, and I mean, whether it was lack of funding, lack of those connections, but see, that's about priorities, right? Like, how badly did we want that? Yeah. And that was very, I mean, I'm biased, but I'm saying for me personally, what I saw was something that I would gather my family around and watch on a Friday evening, Yeah. So if that was the case, what did we do to amplify?
Yeah. Right.
Yeah.
You're definitely right, Khadija, that it's very difficult because there's a lot of people in our communities who just wouldn't feel comfortable in a bigger industry like that,
Yeah, and I think it's important, like in our own Muslim communities, to find some sort of way of organizing ourselves so that when things like this happen, we are already in a place where we can stand up for ourselves. Because when these things do happen currently, it's always individuals who are standing up for Islam. And it's individuals that are put to the side that the majority of the Muslim community don't know about. And if we organize ourselves in a way that we're better able to handle these situations when they come up, we'd be in a better place to get more representative media out there. Because these issues are going to come up over and over again. And the only way we can combat it is if we're in a position where we can, And it's like things as simple as speaking about the fact that we should protest at the end of a Jumu'ah khutbah, or talking about it in youth groups. Things that are simple and things that can really be spread to the majority of the Muslim Ummah who identify as Muslims and who represent Islam, so that when they are speaking up, they can talk about Islam in a way that's more knowledgeable.
Yeah.
So yeah, and Khadija, going back to the question that you asked, I still think it's something that you can't do just on one forefront. Like, you can go into independent film, but the only way you'll have those connections with Western media to get the independent films promoted in a way that gets it out to the most people is if you have those connections with the Western media, the Western film industry, with Hollywood. And so I think even if we just have a lot of Muslims playing small roles in a representative fashion in Western media and just building up on that slowly over time, because I don't see how this is going to happen except if it's really slowly or slower than we would want. Yeah. And just building that up so that you're increasing awareness and increasing understanding of how we want to be represented and what is okay with us. I think that's the solution that I can think of. Come at it from two angles so that you're able to produce these independent films and movies and things like that, but get it promoted because you have those connections.
Definitely. And I guess at the end of the day, Hollywood is a business, so them playing Muslim characters, what would be the benefit to them? Is there a Muslim audience? Are we a passive audience where we'll take whatever we get, right? We'll be okay with watching any other movie anyway? Or are we people who really would hang on if we had that representation? And I think we would. So we're a consumer group. Yeah. That sounds really bad, but we are a consumer group that could be potentially tapped in for their benefit. But also, that would mean changing pop culture, which I think is a gigantic thing. And like you said, it's going to be gradual, but media is only a representation of what a country, especially with industries as big as Hollywood, want to show. So if it gets to the point where Muslims being casual, not main leads even, but like side actors or whatever, actresses, we've gotten to a very different point. Very different point. Because it is fueled by popular culture, and that would mean popular culture had to shift.
Yeah.
And accepted Muslims in a way that they haven't.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I mean, at this point, we're still fighting for, like, just to put things into context, for having female leads get more minutes on screen time than male leads, for being paid less, right?
Yeah.
For people of color to get main leads at all, right?
Yeah.
And to not be, regardless of religion, to not be just, if you're brown or black, to just hit that. I mean, Hassan Minhaj, he got one show on I don't know where, and the whole world flipped out.
Yeah.
Right? And I mean, the pay thing. I mean, so we have to figure out where we stand in regards to the domino effect of minority groups.
And it's also like these are issues that people have been fighting for decades and decades. And if they haven't been changed yet, it just shows how slowly the system works in creating change.
Yeah, definitely. And I think British media needs a shout out, because I feel, I don't know if it's just me, but they're like leaps and bounds ahead of American media with regards to portraying Muslims. I don't know what the cultural history of immigrants and Muslims integrating into British popular cultures, but I feel like they definitely have a bigger role in British media. I mean, it might be like the whole colonial thing, but because, I mean, you walk at every couple streets and there's a curry shop, and curry is apparently like the national food or something. But I mean, I gotta give them credit. Like, they've done things and they've represented Muslims, definitely. However they've done so, but it's there.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think it also just might be the fact that Muslim immigrants came to England decades before Muslim immigrants came to the US. And I think because it was so different, Muslims were seen more, and that might have propelled the industry to sort of include them more. And also there's a lot more of them. Like you were saying, Muslims are a huge part of the population in England and in Britain. And that might be one aspect of it. Because I think that, like, with Black Muslims in the US, it wasn't like, oh, we need to promote ourselves through film and entertainment. That was not the goal. And so it might have been that there were a lot of Muslims in England, and also there are a lot of Muslims who want to see themselves represented and are more demanding about it than we are.
Yeah. We should learn from them.
Yeah, definitely. Because, yes, we're a smaller population here, but we're growing and we're here and we've been here. And the fact that we don't see ourselves is not a good thing.
Exactly. And if we're talking about, like, Western media, they're the West, too.
Yeah. And talking about Western media, Khadija, one thing that when I was trying to figure out solutions for how we can better represent ourselves, you said something along the lines of amplifying Muslim Western ideologies and characters instead of constantly reaching globally to represent the experience of Muslims in the Western world.
Yeah, so you know how every movie or film we've talked about, and I keep going back to Aladdin, and I don't want to keep talking about only Aladdin, but you know how
it's a good example.
The oppressed Muslim female image, or the oppressor male in the relationship, like the dad, the brother, the godson, the husband, whatever, it's usually always set somewhere else, or the narrative is foreign, like we talked about last episode. And so what I was trying to say by that is, you know how we say that media is a reflection of popular culture? And as Muslims, we do have our popular culture within our own community. I'm talking Muslims in America.
Yeah.
Be that religious traditions or the small things that we have to face on a daily basis, or, like, you know, these crazy jokes we make about niqabi problems or hashtag hijabi problems, all of that, everything.
Yeah.
And we talk about, you know, our relationship with our parents, generational differences, or even our culture clashes, whatever it might be, or, like, I don't know, everything.
Yeah.
That can be part of the story of being Muslims in America, right?
Yeah.
So we don't need to go far, is what I'm trying to say, to make an awesome, tantalizing narrative. It's right here. Reality is so much more dramatic often than trying to, you know, string together hopeless pieces of this mesh of brown world in God knows where, right? algebra. So, like, we don't need to tap anywhere else but our own community is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, and I think it's also the whole idea of representation. Who are we trying to represent? We're trying to represent Muslims in the Western world, Muslims in America. And if we're constantly reaching back, we're giving a non-representative narrative for people to feed off of when that's not how we actually live our lives. That's not what being a Western Muslim actually looks like. So it's just going back to like proper representation and doing things in a way that is authentic to ourselves.
Right.
The last thing I did want to talk about, we've discussed different methods that can be used to get more accurate representation, the different angles to come at accurate representation from. And I think it's also important to have some sort of guidelines of what we consider to be authentic representation, like what works and what doesn't work. I think that oftentimes there's a lot of gray areas. And so I was looking for something of the sort, and I found an article by a Muslim chaplain at Loyola University in Chicago. His name is Omar Muzaffar. And he made like a test to use against like bigotry in films about Muslims. And so it has like 6 core points that every movie that represents Muslims should have in them. And so, yeah. And I thought it was really cool that he came up with this because before I looked at the article, I wasn't even really thinking about the fact that it's so important to have some sort of guidelines because it's like there can be such a large gray area of what is like appropriate and what is not appropriate. And so having some sort of guidelines and it's something that we can use even to refute films that go against what we consider representative. We can be like, well, this is a test that we made. You don't fit, the criteria for this test, therefore you cannot be representing Muslims. Is something that we can use to our advantage. So the first point was their language is sound. So if they authentically have an accent, then it's fine for them to have the accent in the movie, but it's not okay if you're having Muslims or people representing Muslims faking accents to sound foreign. Sure, Muslims have accents, and a lot of Muslims have accents, but if you're having every representation of a Muslim in a film having an accent, it just sort of implicitly brings about this idea of like otherness. So that was like the first point. And the second point was their behavior is normal. So in movies or films, they're speaking to each other about topics that are normal topics that we discuss in everyday Muslim life. So things that are not about non-Muslims, not about imperialism or colonialism, not about violence, not about depraved sexuality, which are all like the main things that when we're looking at media, this is what we see Muslims representing. So not having those things, or if they do, having those aspects in ways that are authentic to Muslims' everyday life.
Yeah, that's very important.
And it's also like goes back to the idea of like in movies, Muslims a lot of the times, especially males, have huge temper problems, which
right.
I don't know, but all the males that I know that are Muslim don't have huge temper problems. So the representation is so bigoted and misrepresentative. And the third point was that if they're women, they are human. So women are not objectified due to clothing. They're not looked at for their sexuality, not only in the movie to make a point about Islam, but have actual impactful autonomous characters in films. And then the fourth point was if they're pious, they're not naive. So this goes back to the point that we were talking about of how pious Muslims are often looked at in the media as though they don't understand how the world works around them. So in this test, they must be like cultured, civilized individuals, well-versed in Western ideologies, and have firm logical beliefs. So they're not just people who live in some sort of like Muslim bubble that are like waiting to be saved. And the fifth point was that they're independent. So going back to the point that I just said, they don't need to be saved by some Western man. They don't need to be saved from Islam. And then the last point was that their Islam is an actual Islam. So the theology that they're following, the rituals that they do are authentic and verified and connected with reality. So they're things that we actually do. If they're praying in a way that we actually pray. If they're reciting Quran, they're reciting Quran in the way that it's actually supposed to be recited. So yeah, I think these are 6 great points to verify if the movie is being bigoted or if it's representing Muslims accurately.
I mean, so it's one thing if it's like testing for whether or not it's like openly, blatantly bigoted. Yeah. But I don't think like we can actually feasibly construct a test, obviously, for seeing whether or not it's representative. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Because representative is so broad. Like, if I were to make a list of what I thought was representative or what I wanted to see, you wouldn't hear the end of it. So, like, that's a really good, like, off the bat, like, a test for producers to see whether or not what they're doing is blatantly
bigoted.
Exactly.
It's like the baseline.
Yeah.
Yeah. And also, like, I mean, some of it is, like, common sense. Like,
but it's also, like,
know.
The thing is, it's common sense, but it's things that we're seeing over and over again, so I don't know how common sense...
Which makes me wonder if we're looking at this through an innocent lens. Like, do they really not know?
No, I think they know. They just don't want to put in the effort. That's it. That's what it is.
Or it could be like an agenda. Like, we don't know.
Exactly. So then...
Hey, don't ruin her entire podcast idea.
But I think it's a valid point. Like, we don't know what sort of agenda they might be having against Muslims. And that's an important thing to consider as well. But I think this test is just supposed to be a basic test to be able to call out people that are being bigoted against Muslims and also misrepresenting them in these specific ways. And I think, like, representation for Muslims can differ based on the Muslim. So your list of what a representative Muslim looks like could be different from someone else's list. And so I think it's important to have, like, core things that we can use to be like, you're not following these things, therefore you're not represented, and we don't agree with this being published.
Right.
So that's all I wanted to talk, guys, about in terms of the Muslim representation in film and media and the solutions that we can think of that could really better our situation and make media that represents us authentic and wholesome and more accurate to how Muslims actually live in the West. So I wanted to thank you all again for joining me in the second part of the podcast and helping me out in this way. So thank you.
No problem. All right, guys. Assalamualaikum.
Thank you so much, Ruqayya. Waalaikum salam. Waalaikum Smith. Thank you for listening to the second part of our podcast on Muslim representation in film and entertainment media. To hear part 1 of this podcast, please click the link in the description box below.